The sun leaned heavy over the plains, its molten light spilling across the horizon as if the sky itself bled gold. Dust hung in the air like memory, stirred by the steady rhythm of hooves that carried a lone rider toward a town he never loved but could not fully abandon. Caleb Merrick rode with the posture of a man who carried too many stories in his bones, shoulders drawn by scars no one could see, and a silence so profound it clung to him like a second skin. His ranch lay miles behind him, patched together after flames had taken everything once precious, leaving only graves that stood quiet against the rise. 35 years had carved him lean, weathered, and careful with each step into places where whispers gathered faster than truth. The town opened before him in heat shimmer, just another Saturday square, wagons hitched crookedly, men slouched outside the saloon wiping sweat with their hats, horses snorting in the shade. Ordinary until it wasn't. Because what split the air that afternoon wasn't the lazy murmur of trading voices or fiddle strings drifting from a doorway. It was sharper, meaner, like the sound of something breaking. And, at the far edge of the square, where a freight wagon loomed, he saw them. 3 young women bound to its rail, dust streaking their cheeks, their wrists cut raw by rope. A wooden sign leaned against the wheel, its paint still fresh, declaring them forfeited by law, as if human lives could be weighed against a debt lost in a game. Caleb's jaw set like iron. He had seen cruelty before. War had carved enough of it into him. But no matter how many times it crossed his path, it always struck low and hard, like a stone thrown into his gut. He reined his horse tighter, feeling the animal's tension match his own, and stepped down into the dirt. Boots hit the ground with the finality of choice, for leaving them tied there was not something his soul could stomach. He threaded through the half-circle of men who watched with hungry eyes, the stench of sweat, whiskey, and horse-piss heavy around them. The sheriff lounged nearby, thumbs hooked in his belt, as if justice were just another game of cards. Caleb didn't speak. His gaze moved from the sign to the sisters. The eldest stood defiant, chin lifted though her dress was torn and clung damp against her ribs, her eyes meeting his without plea, only fire. Beside her, the middle sister sheltered the youngest, barely 16, trembling and barefoot, her small frame shaking each time a man spat into the dust. Strength, fear, dignity, all braided together in that fragile tableau. Caleb's heart clenched, not with softness, but with something steadier. The conviction that no chain of law, no decree painted on wood could name their worth. When the sheriff muttered the price, $30 for the lot, Caleb's hands didn't tremble. Each coin he laid down rang sharp against the wagon board, a sound that cut through the murmuring crowd. One by one, he untied them. The eldest flinched at his touch, but didn't turn away. The middle measured him with a glance that carried both suspicion and reluctant trust. The youngest stumbled forward, and Caleb caught her weight gently, steadying her until she found her footing again. No one stopped him. The square fell silent, men shifting their hats, the heat pressing heavier as if even the air held its breath. He led them toward his horse, lifting the younger sisters to the mule, and then extending his hand to the eldest. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, chin still raised, eyes fierce as though daring him to prove himself. Then, slowly, she placed her hand in his, letting him draw her up behind him. Without a word, he guided them out of the square, the noise of the town dissolving behind them, leaving only the rhythm of hooves and the creak of leather straps. The road west stretched long beneath the slanting sun, silence woven between them like fragile thread. Behind him he felt the eldest's breath, steady but tight, her grip on the saddle careful. Not too loose, not too desperate. The middle sister rode close with her arms wrapped protectively around the youngest, whose head began to nod with exhaustion. Caleb kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, mind turning over the work waiting at the ranch and the unknown weight of 3 strangers now bound to him, not by law, not by debt, but by the simple truth that leaving them had never been an option. This was no ordinary evening ride. It was the quiet birth of something unspoken, responsibility perhaps, or the first fragile thread of belonging, and the kind of beginning that whispered promises into the dusk. And if, as you listen, your heart feels that tug of tenderness, that warmth of knowing healing can grow even from scars, let it settle gently inside you. If these words give you a spark of comfort, of curiosity, I'd be grateful if you showed a little love back, like leave a comment, maybe subscribe, so more hearts can ride with us into this story. Because what waits beyond the next bend is not just survival, but the possibility of love where none was meant to grow. And with that, the road carried them deeper into the west, toward the ranch, toward silence that was no longer empty, but on the edge of becoming something more. The land opened wide under the fading sun, the earth painted in long shadows that stretched across scrub and stone. Caleb kept the horse at a steady pace, his jaw set, the weight of silence settling between him and the 3 sisters trailing close. The road west had no mercy, but it was familiar to him. The rise where the grass grew thin, the dry creek bed where hawks circled, the lone cottonwood that bent with the wind. He knew every curve as if carved into his bones. Behind him, Mara, the eldest, sat straight-backed, her grip light on the saddle horn, her presence steady even when fear pressed into her breath. He could feel it in the way her body held tension, not broken, only guarded, like a gate that refused to swing open without reason. The mule carried the other 2 sisters, the middle one guiding with careful hands, her eyes darting from horizon to horizon, as if expecting danger to rise from the dust. The youngest, half asleep, leaned against her shoulder, her bare feet swinging gently with the rhythm of the animal's gait. For a long while, the only sound was leather creaking and hooves pressing into dirt. Yet beneath the quiet, something else stirred. The fragile hum of belonging, faint but alive, like the first tune a child hums when they've found safety. When the ranch came into view, it was no grand sight, only a low cabin set against the slope, a crooked corral, a cottonwood near the creek, catching the last light. But to Caleb, it was more than timber and nails. It was what he had rebuilt after fire and grief, the place where he had stood alone for years. To the sisters, it was unknown ground. Mara's eyes measured it carefully as he swung down, offering his hand. This time she didn't hesitate. Though her chin stayed high, her jaw still tight, as if weighing whether trust was earned or borrowed. Inside, the cabin held little: a single bed, a table by the hearth, chairs worn smooth by use, but it was clean, tended with quiet diligence. Caleb cleared space in the lean-to, laying blankets across the floor for them. The middle sister tested the corners, cautious but willing. The youngest clutched her blanket like an anchor, and Mara lingered in the doorway, her gaze sweeping the room before she finally stepped inside. Caleb lit the stove, set beans to warm, laid bread and coffee on the table. When Mara carried the bucket to the pump, rinsing the dust from her arms, the sight caught something in his chest. Not beauty dressed fine, but resilience laid bare in the way her movements carried dignity even through exhaustion. They ate in silence, spoons scraping tin plates, firelight softening the shadows on their faces. Caleb didn't watch them outright, but he saw the smallest things. The youngest daring a glance at him, the middle sister stacking dishes without being asked, Mara's hand brushing his as she reached for a cloth and pulling back quick, not in fear, but in caution. Later, when night folded tight around the cabin, he said only, "You're safe here." Mara's answer came quiet, steady. "For how long?" His reply, "As long as you want," wasn't promise or oath, only truth in his voice. She held his gaze a moment longer before lying down beside her sisters, the fire casting faint light over her face. Caleb stretched onto his bed, listening to the sound of 3 steady breaths beyond the wall. The silence was no longer the echo of emptiness. It was softer now, carrying the weight of presence. For the first time in years, the cabin felt more than a place to endure. It felt like a beginning. Outside, the wind moved through cottonwood leaves, whispering as if even the land itself understood that healing often began in quiet moments, in rooms no longer hollow, in lives that had been broken but dared to mend. The night held them gently, and the road they had ridden together was only the first step towards something none of them yet had the words to name. Morning broke cold and pale, the kind of dawn that carried a hush before the land woke. Caleb stepped outside first, his breath visible in the crisp air, boots marking dark prints across dew-wet grass. He walked the fence line with steady purpose, eyes scanning for tracks, listening for any sound out of place. No trouble had come in the night, and that eased the weight he carried in his chest. When he returned, smoke trailed from the chimney, and inside the sisters stirred softly, the rhythm of a house no longer empty. Mara was the first to rise, her dark hair pulled into a braid, her eyes steady on him as if waiting for direction, but unwilling to appear uncertain. He told her simply, "Fill the barrel halfway. 2 trips." She nodded, no argument, only resolve, and led her sisters to the pump. The middle girl worked the handle, water splashing into the bucket, cheeks pink with cold, while the youngest laughed faintly when the spray dotted her skin. Caleb watched from the porch, arms crossed, the sight striking him as more healing than he expected. 3 voices, however quiet, threading life into a place that had been hushed too long. Inside, he set out coffee, biscuits, and the last of the beans. They ate without tension this time, the youngest daring a question about his solitude. "Had a wife," he answered, voice even, "buried on the rise behind the barn." Silence fell, but it was a softer one, respectful. And for the first time, Mara lowered her gaze, not from fear, but from reverence. That shift, small as it was, settled deeper than words. The day stretched into work. Caleb handed Mara a broom, and she swept the planks with sharp precision, as if determined to prove her worth. When she caught him watching, she challenged with a half-smile, "You going to stand there all day?" It was the first spark of humor, brief but real. The middle sister carried feed to the chickens, flinching once when they rushed her, but standing her ground, while the youngest giggled when a hen pecked at her boot. Caleb said little, yet in his silence there was approval. Later, repairing a fallen fence post, he placed the wood in Mara's hands. "Hold it straight," he told her. She planted her boots, braced with strength that surprised him. His hammer struck iron into wood, each ring sharp in the cold air, and when the rail stood firm, he gave a rare nod. "Good hold." The words were plain, but they made her lips twitch as if a smile threatened. She moved to the next post without waiting, and Caleb realized it had been years since he worked beside anyone who matched his rhythm. By evening, the cabin no longer looked like a man's shelter against loneliness. It bore the faint outline of a home. The youngest hummed a tune while drying dishes, the middle folded blankets neatly, and Mara lingered by the fire after her sisters had gone to the lean-to. She spoke quietly, without accusation. "You paid for all three. You could have taken just one." Caleb's answer came slow, deliberate. "Wasn't about taking. It was about getting you out." She studied him long. Then her shoulders dropped, a weight loosening from her frame. When the house quieted, he lay awake listening to their breaths, steady as a lullaby. The silence had changed again. It was no longer hollow, but layered with the fragile warmth of presence. Outside, a hawk's cry echoed against the ridge, the land wide and waiting. Inside, the air held the first pulse of trust, faint but undeniable, and in it lived the beginning of something steady, something healing, something that could carry them all into the days ahead. The days settled into rhythm, the kind that stitched itself into the bones without notice, chores done with steady hands, meals shared in a hush that softened as hours passed. The cabin, once hollow with echo, grew warmer with every sound the sisters brought. The broom rasping across the planks, the middle girl humming scraps of forgotten songs, the youngest laughing when chickens chased her across the yard. Caleb watched without intrusion, his silence not empty now, but protective, as if words might break what was still fragile. Mara moved through the rooms with purpose. She swept floors with precise strokes, stirred beans on the stove, and carried water from the pump with shoulders squared against cold morning air. Yet every motion bore a quiet challenge, as if daring him to treat her as less than equal. One afternoon, when a rail on the south corral split, she walked beside him without waiting for instruction. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, voice steady. Caleb placed the post in her hands, his calloused fingers brushing hers for only a second. "Hold it level." She braced herself firm against the earth, sweat streaking her temple, her grip unwavering as he drove the spike home. When the rail stood true, he gave her 2 words, "Good work." Plain words, but they struck deeper than he knew. Mara carried them like a hidden ember, warming places she had kept cold for too long. Evenings brought a different kind of closeness. The sisters took their places in the lean-to, whispering softly to one another before sleep, while Mara lingered by the fire. She washed tin plates, sleeves rolled back, her hands brushing his now and then as she passed a dishcloth. "You don't say much," she murmured once, her gaze catching his across the fire's glow. Caleb shrugged lightly. "Don't have much to say." She studied him then, eyes narrowing as if peeling away silence to find the man beneath. "Then why bring us here?" He set the last plate aside, his voice low but sure. "Because no one else was going to. and because you didn't deserve what was coming." For a long moment she held his gaze, searching for a crack, a lie, and found none. Her shoulders eased, and she turned back to the basin, though something softer lingered in her eyes. Nights were no longer haunted by emptiness. The youngest slept without trembling, the middle girl rested with peace on her face, and Mara kept watch by the door, less out of fear, more from habit. Caleb lay awake, listening to the sound of their breaths mixing with the quiet crackle of coals. The silence had shifted once more, not merely absence of noise, but a blanket laid over old wounds, a healing calm that reached even him. When dawn returned, frost silvered the ground, and the sky blushed pale. Caleb rose early, his boots crunching over frozen grass, and found the sisters already at work. Mara's braid caught the first light as she carried the bucket, the middle girl scattering feed with a calmness she hadn't shown before, and the youngest hummed as though the chill could not touch her. He paused a moment, taking in the sight, the warmth of it threading through the cold morning. Something in his chest, long hardened, loosened. The ranch no longer stood as a man's burden alone. It was becoming a shared place, a home slowly filling with life, a fragile promise that what had been broken might yet be mended. And with that thought, the day began, the land wide and waiting, their footsteps weaving a path into a future none of them had dared to imagine before. The days rolled forward with a quiet steadiness, the kind that softened edges worn sharp by hardship. Each sunrise brought with it a pattern of labor and small discoveries, and though no one spoke of it, the ranch itself seemed to breathe easier, as though welcoming the presence of new hands and new voices. The cabin walls that once echoed with silence now carried the faint hum of life, footsteps crossing the floor, the scrape of a chair, the warmth of voices blending into evening. Mara worked with calm determination, her movements measured yet purposeful, every sweep of the broom and every turn of the pot on the stove, bearing the weight of someone proving not just her place, but her strength. Caleb noticed it in the way she planted her feet when hauling water, in the unwavering grip she gave when bracing the post he hammered into the earth. He gave her no praise beyond a nod, no more words than good hold or straight enough. Yet those simple acknowledgments seemed to kindle a light behind her guarded eyes. She carried them quietly, like embers she refused to let die. The middle sister settled easily into her tasks, mending seams with steady hands, humming small fragments of songs that carried a soft comfort through the rooms. The youngest moved with unrestrained joy, her laughter rising when hens chased after her, or when her bare toes splashed through the shallow creek. Caleb, watching from the porch, found something healing in the sound, laughter where once there had been only silence. It reminded him that a house could be more than wood and stone. It could be warmed by the lives within it. Evenings stretched long golden light spilling across the plains before folding into fireglow. Supper was quieter now, but no longer tense. Spoons scraping against tin plates, the occasional murmur of voices, the rhythm of a shared meal. Afterward, while her sisters slipped into their blankets, Mara lingered. She cleared the table, washed the dishes, and stayed near the fire where its warmth flickered against her face. Caleb dried plates beside her, their shoulders brushing now and then, their silence not uncomfortable but companionable, like two currents running side by side. One night, when her sleeve slipped loose and his eyes caught the line of her arm, he looked away quickly, jaw tight, though he did not leave. Mara noticed, and something softened in her expression, a small easing of the weight she carried. Trust was growing, though neither named it. It lived in small gestures, the way Caleb passed her the tin of salt without being asked, the way Mara looked him in the eye a fraction longer before turning back to her work, the way he left the door open during supper as though daring the world to test what they had built. The silence no longer felt empty. It held warmth, healing, and the quiet beginning of belonging. At night, as the fire settled to embers, Caleb lay awake, listening to the sisters' breathing. The sound filled the cabin with a gentleness he had not known for years. It was not peace in its fullness, not yet, but it was the shape of peace coming alive. Outside, the wind swept softly through the cottonwood, carrying the hush of the land. Inside, the air carried a deeper promise, that broken lives, set carefully together, could begin to mend into something whole. And with each passing day, that promise grew stronger, steady as the dawn waiting beyond the horizon. The peace that had settled over the ranch was not meant to last unchallenged. 2 weeks after the corral was mended, dust rose on the horizon in a straight, deliberate line. 3 riders abreast, their silhouettes cut sharp against the pale sky. Caleb stood at the rail, his hands rough with work, wiping them on his shirt as his jaw set hard. He did not call out in alarm, only in command. Inside. Mara stepped onto the porch, caught sight of the riders, and without question pulled her sisters in, barring the door, her face steady, though her eyes burned with the knowledge of what was coming. By the time the men reined up in the yard, Caleb was planted wide in front of the porch, rifle leaning against the wall behind him, close enough to reach, but not yet in his hands. The lead rider grinned mean, the same man who had sneered at the square weeks before. "We came to settle this proper," he said. Caleb's voice was level, unshaken. "Already settled." The man spat into the dust, mocking. "Paper don't mean much out here if no one's willing to back it." Caleb didn't move, his eyes held steady, a weight heavier than any words. Behind the shuttered window, Mara held her sisters close, every muscle taut, yet her hand on the youngest's knuckles was steady, a healing anchor against the tremor of fear. The rider pressed forward, sneering louder. "You think you can keep 3 you bought off a wagon? Ancient law says you marry or give 'em back." Caleb's jaw flexed once. "Judge says they're free. They stay because they choose to." A harsh laugh broke from one of the men. "Women don't get to choose. Not out here." Caleb's hand twitched near the rifle, but he did not lift it. His reply was iron. "They do here." Tension cracked the air, the moment on the edge of violence, until hooves thundered from the road. The sheriff arrived with 2 men, dust swirling around their mounts, a folded paper at his belt. "Judge signed these," the sheriff called out, voice carrying across the yard. "Any man who tries to claim these girls now answers in court." The lead rider's grin faltered, eyes darting between the badge and Caleb's unyielding stance. Spite dripped from his mouth, but he turned his horse at last, spitting into the dirt. "This ain't over," he muttered. Caleb's voice cut like stone. "Yes, it is." The riders left, hooves fading to silence. Only then did Mara open the door, pale but unbroken, her gaze fixed on Caleb. He leaned the rifle back against the wall, exhaling slow, the weight of restraint heavier than battle. She stepped down from the porch, stopping close enough to touch. "You didn't fire," she said softly. "Didn't have to," he answered. Her hand reached for his, brief, firm, a squeeze that said more than words, before she slipped back inside where her sisters waited. That night, the cabin breathed differently. The youngest asked in a whisper if the men would return, and Mara brushed hair from her brow. "Not after today," she said, her voice a balm, even if she did not fully believe it. Caleb sat long by the fire, the sheriff's paper on the table beside him, its edges curling in the heat. Trouble had come, tested the strength of what they were building, and turned back. The silence that followed was not hollow, but earned, like ground made firmer by the storm that passed. The cabin walls seemed to stand stronger, the air thicker with a sense of belonging. Outside, wind stirred through the cottonwood, and inside, the fire glowed steady, carrying them all into the kind of night where rest came easier, and the heart learned that safety could be more than a fleeting dream. The ranch changed after the riders turned back. The air no longer carried the tight edge of waiting. It moved freer, as if the land itself had sighed in relief. The sisters stepped more lightly through the cabin, the middle one humming as she mended Caleb's shirts by the window, the youngest laughing when hens chased after her scattering feed, and Mara moving with quiet certainty, as though she had finally claimed the ground beneath her feet. Caleb felt it too. He built narrow beds in the cleared side room, sanding the wood smooth so quilts would not catch. And when the middle sister set the blankets with pride, the space looked less like storage and more like home. Mara took to cooking, sleeves rolled, turning bacon in the skillet, while Caleb came in from the yard, sweat marking his shirt from fence work. She glanced once at the pale scar across his shoulder, where the fabric clung, her chest tightening not with fear, but with something new, something unnamed. That night, when her sisters settled into their new beds, she stayed behind, washing dishes in the firelight. Caleb dried them silently, their movements falling into rhythm until the quiet was heavier than words. "You meant it," she said suddenly, her voice low but sure, "about us choosing to stay." He set the plate aside, meeting her gaze with steady calm. "I meant it." She looked at him long, then said softly, "Then I'm choosing." The air thickened between them, heavy with the truth of it. Caleb moved slowly, deliberately, until he stood close enough that the warmth from the stove mingled with the heat of their breath. His hand rose, brushing her cheek with the same care he gave a skittish colt. She did not flinch. The kiss that followed was not rushed, but steady, built from every look and every silence they had carried since that day in the square. Mara stepped closer, her hands against his chest, steadying herself in the rhythm of his heart. When they drew apart, her smile, unguarded, soft, was the first he had ever seen from her. "I'm not afraid any more," she whispered. That night she did not return to the lean-to. She stayed beside the fire with him, their voices low, speaking of work to be done, grain to store, fences to mend, mundane things that mattered only because they kept them near each other. When at last they lay together, it was with care, steady as the man himself, a joining that felt less like conquest and more like healing. Outside, wind stirred the cottonwood, but inside, warmth lingered even after the fire sank to embers. At dawn, Mara rose with him, tying her hair back with his spare handkerchief. The middle sister caught sight of her stepping from his room, said nothing, only smiled faintly and returned to her work. The youngest hummed as she scattered feed, as though she had always known this moment would come. The house felt settled now, not a shelter against fear, but a home claimed by choice. where silence carried warmth, and the future no longer seemed like a road to outrun, but a place to stay. The morning light fell across the porch, and in it, Caleb knew the shape of his life had changed, not by law, not by obligation, but by love, quietly chosen and deeply kept. The frost came soft that morning, silvering the grass and glazing the fence rails, the air sharp enough that every breath hung like smoke. Caleb hitched the mule to the wagon, while inside the cabin the sisters packed bread, coffee, and a jar of beans. No one spoke of why they were going to town. Every heart understood. The judge's paper tucked beneath the floorboards had secured freedom, but freedom alone was not enough. Caleb wanted something more enduring, something that no man's sneer or spit in the dust could unravel. The ride was slow, steady. The middle sister sat tall on the bench, no longer glancing over her shoulder as she once had, her hands resting sure in her lap. The youngest pointed out a hawk circling the ridge, her voice light, free of trembling. Mara sat beside Caleb, her hair tied neatly with his handkerchief, her hand resting close enough to brush his, the space between them filled with quiet understanding. When the town square opened before them, eyes turned their way. Some men smirked, some spat, but none spoke. Caleb guided the mule straight to the clerk's office, the bell above the door ringing sharp as they stepped inside. The judge asked little, his eyes moving between Caleb and Mara. "This is what you want?" Mara lifted her chin, her voice steady. "Yes." The pen scratched across the page, ink marking their choice into law. Caleb drew the ring from his pocket, its silver worn but strong, and slid it onto her finger with 2 words. "My wife." Her reply, firm as the land they stood on. "My husband." It was not just ritual, it was anchor, it was declaration, it was healing woven into the marrow of 2 lives that had long known loss. When they stepped outside, the air of the square felt altered. The same men watched, but their faces shifted. Some nodded faintly, others touched the brims of their hats, as if acknowledging that something had been settled beyond words. The sheriff stood by the rail, his voice carrying low. "That should put an end to it." Caleb gave a single nod, his hand steady on Mara's as they turned back toward the wagon. The ride home carried no tension, only a quiet warmth, the kind that stretched into the very bones of the land. At the cabin, the mule was unhitched, the fire inside rekindled, and the sisters moved with the ease of those who belonged. The middle one put away supplies with the rhythm of habit, the youngest scattered grain to the hens, laughter bright as morning bells. Mara lingered on the porch, fingers brushing the new band on her hand, as though making sure it was real. When Caleb returned from the yard, she stepped into his arms without hesitation, their kiss no longer tentative but sure, a seal pressed not only on lips, but on the life they would share. That night, the fire glowed soft against the cabin walls. Mara lay with Caleb, her hand resting over his heart, the ring gleaming in its quiet promise. In the next room, the sisters slept soundly, their breaths steady, unafraid. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood, carrying whispers of seasons to come. Inside, the air was filled with warmth, not of flame alone, but of roots sinking deep into soil, of love that had taken hold where once there had been only emptiness. The house no longer felt like a stop on a lonely road. It was home, alive, enduring, steady as dawn. If this story touched something gentle in your heart, if it gave you a breath of healing warmth, I invite you to walk with me further. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe so we can keep weaving more journeys of love, courage, and new beginnings together. Your presence here matters more than you know.